2, 3, 4.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the Power of Music Thinking. My name is Christoph Zürn, and this is the podcast for people with a musical heart and a wicked job. We're looking for stories, insights and tools from the big world of music to inspire leaders and followers to listen, tune, play, and perform in whatever field you're operating. Today we are in Oakland, California, and we talk with Steve Keller, audio alchemist and sonic strategy director at Pandora. We talk about audio-only and audio-first strategies in the platinum age of audio, how COVID has changed our listening habits, and how leaders can foster the ability to listen inside their companies. We learn about his research on sonic racism, and he shares with us a little ritual that he uses before brainstorm sessions that matter. So, welcome, Steve.
Hi, Christoph. I'm excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Great to have you on the show. Steve, I would like to start with a short question. And that's, what's your first memorable sonic experience that had an impact on you?
Wow. I would have to say, thinking back when I was first captured by the power of music was when I was a child. And my parents bought a record that was put out by the Disney company that was called Great Composers. And so it was just an LP back in the day before we were listening to cassettes or streaming audio. And it was a collection of great composers with little stories about their lives. And I was just fascinated with Beethoven and his story, the power of music, how he was hearing impaired, but still the music was so expressive, and that compelled me to ask my parents if I could take piano lessons.
Wow.
And this was around the age of 5, 6 years
wow.
old, and that's when I started playing piano, and music has been a part of my life and my career ever since.
Wow, great. Now let's talk about your career. So maybe you can tell us who you are and what you're doing.
Yes. I've had a meandering path, but where I've landed at the moment is I'm the sonic strategy director for Studio Resonate. And I'll begin by, answering the question that many people automatically feed back to me, which is sonic strategy director. That's a really cool title, but what is that? And so I've kind of explained it by saying, I'm the guy that blends sound science with sound art to help our clients make sound decisions. And so Studio Resonate is the in-house audio-first creative consultancy for SXM Media. And as such, I'm working with Pandora, which is the music streaming service here in the US, one of the first streaming services that was launched in the world. But many people worldwide don't know about Pandora because of its limitations to the US. I also work with SXM satellite radio, and so their footprint. And then we recently acquired Stitcher, which is a podcasting company, and we represent all of the ad inventory for SoundCloud. So with all of those combined, we represent probably around 75% of the digital advertising media in the US. 150 million listening ears that we get into through the course of a day. So that's the story of the title and the job.
And what exactly are you doing? so if we hear the title,
Sure.
we understand. But what's your daily business?
Well, my background, my field of expertise is looking at how music and sound can impact perception and behavior. And so music and sound is a part of advertising. We're all familiar with seeing or hearing commercials where there's a music track or there's a voiceover or there's sound design. And I look at ways that we can make better decisions about choices for music, for sound, the way that a brand will show up in multiple places, not just commercials, but what happens when you call and you get put on hold. What's the sound of the UX or UI that's part of an app? Maybe there's an Alexa skill in terms of smart speakers that is used. Maybe there's music or sound in the environment of a store or retail. And how do we build consistent sonic experiences that not only communicate a perception of the brand, but have an impact on maybe a consumer's perception of how long they've been on hold, or how they're moving through an environment, or how they're responding to a notification sound, or how they're remembering the brand just from a particular sound that they're hearing, much like a visual identity of the brand is a way that you recognize a brand when you see it. What's the audio identity that you recognize when you hear it? So that's very broad, but as you can hear in that description, there's the science and the art that's a part of that I'm always blending together to help the clients understand how to make better choices when it comes to sound and the use of sound.
And how would this work together? Because we know all the agencies, we know the visual the visual identities, and sometimes people say, "Oh yeah, and we need something for, let's say, a podcast trailer or something like this." And are you then working with them together? And also maybe to add another question, does it sometimes appear that clients come first to you for the sonic identity and then later go to graphic identity?
It can happen in a lot of different ways, and every client is a little different. So the work is very collaborative. So obviously, when you're working on sound, you need to involve all the stakeholders. You have the brand, you have the marketing arm of the brand. You also very often have advertising agencies that are involved with the brand. Sometimes social media agencies, sometimes UX and UI designers. Sometimes it's about the sound of the product itself, where you can then get into relating with the manufacturers. So it really kind of depends on where in this sonic ecosystem you're showing up. Who are the stakeholders there, and who do you need to collaborate with? Typically, we find that most brands have the visual identities first. And brands have been very intentional with the development of those visual identities. They look at the symbols that they're using, the values in the brand. They develop a typography. They go to great lengths to trademark and copyright these marks. They build brand guidelines to make sure that the visuals are always used consistently. There's specific colors that are associated. And unfortunately, sound and music are very often an afterthought. They'll think about it when they need music for a commercial. And so the change for us is helping our clients understand that they can put just as much rigor and discipline in the development of a sonic identity as they do with their visual identity. So it's rare that a client will come to us and not have any visual identity, and we start with the sonic identity. Usually it's following, but the trick is helping clients make that connection between the time and resources that they're devoting to their visual identity. Let's do the same with your sonic identity, because the impact on brand salience, on memory, on engagement with clients, on long-term branding strategies and emotional connections really are driven as much, if not more, by what a consumer hears than what a consumer sees. And if you can get both of those things working together, then we're getting into cross-modal science, super additivity, and the way when we combine all of our senses in a congruent manner, it magnifies the experience. So it really is about how we use what we know from science to help creators, artists that are coming into play in creating the sounds, to create sounds that are targeted and effective in the way we need them to be.
Wow.
Wow, that was an awful lot. As we talk, you'll see I tend to babble on as the brook, as I say. But there's a lot to unpack.
But that's why I invited you. So, Steve, you just touched the advertising business, and also mentioned the social media. And we once also met in Clubhouse, and this would be actually a game changer for your business. Can you explore a little bit more? And you're doing some activities there.
Yes, sure. Well, I think very often when I'm presenting to brands, and this is a great segue because it kind of builds on what I was just saying. When I began the presentation, I have 3 observations. The first observation is sound moves us. There's no question about that. You started with what was the sound I remember, early on. And We've got this soundtrack of our lives if we stop and think about it. So there's no question about that. And yet, for all its power, music and sound are an undervalued asset. That's the second point. And I just said very often it's the last thing people think about. They're not as disciplined. But the third observation is that we've entered, what I'm calling the platinum age of audio, where, in the early days before television, you had radio and, you were reaching consumers through sound. And in some ways, history is repeating itself in the sense that now we're opening up channels that I would call, either audio only or audio first. Audio first means that it revolves around sound. Audio only is that's the only expression. So we have channels like smart speakers now, where you're speaking and being spoken to. How are brands showing up there? Here's an environment where there is no visual. There's no text. So how do you as a brand stand out from every other brand on that quote unquote digital shelf? You can't see the packaging. You can't see the colors. We can only hear you. So that's forcing these conversations. And there's also, the way that COVID has kind of transformed us in terms of our listening habits, kind of leaning into streaming services a little more. And during this time, we have the rise of an app like Clubhouse, which is in many ways, it's like a live podcast. It's like talk radio. You have the ability to listen in, but at any point in time, you can raise your hand, be invited to the stage, have these conversations, and that app has exploded to the point now where we see Twitter playing with Twitter Spaces. LinkedIn is talking about having an audio channel like this. Spotify just did an acquisition of a company that it looks like they're going to attempt to develop their version of Clubhouse. And so these are spaces where consumers are living, where they're hanging out, and brands can begin to think about, how do I participate in this space? And some brands are starting to do this. I saw recently that International House of Pancakes had a room on Clubhouse that was just the sound of sizzling bacon.
All right.
It was in some ways clever, but I think where brands have to be careful is thinking about how they're showing up in these spaces. Yeah. Which again, it's not simply about showing up and talking at people. It's about bringing value. And you have to think about that sonically too. What's the value that you're bringing? So this platinum age of audio is forcing brands to start asking the question, how am I showing up in these spaces? What is my sonic identity? How am I consistent in the literal voice of my brand? Which leads us into conversations like we're having today.
Yeah, absolutely. This is also something that, when I think about it, if we think this a bit further, this could also mean that we could expect a lot of sound logos when we go into Clubhouse or in other situations, or even, and if I bring it even further and say I do a personal branding, so everybody that speaks, besides his voice, his
Yes.
timbre in the voice, the way you speak, would then
Yes.
maybe be interrupted by a commercial and started with a sound logo. How do you see this?
Well, I think this is a very important question, and I think this speaks to, again, how are we making choices? Because if we're only thinking about sound tactically, oh, I've got a sonic logo, let me just use that, or I've got a brand theme or a jingle. There's a danger that it just becomes noise, like anything else. So, what is the strategy for how you use sound to be distinctive? Part of a sonic identity could also be silence. So where do you have these moments where things are quiet or you pause? How do you build the dynamics? I think of electric vehicles, and because of the legal mandates, there's a danger if a vehicle is so silent that you don't hear it. What happens if you step out, in front of one, or if your sight is impaired? And so many of these car manufacturers are now designing sounds for the cars, and it gives them a way to sonically brand the vehicle and be clever. But I often wonder, how will this change our city soundscapes?
Yeah.
Now we're not hearing the noise of engines, but we're hearing the noise of, a digital replication, if you will, of that engine. How are the companies going to work together? Because if they worked together, they could perhaps find ways to blend these sounds, in a way that's very harmonious. That leads me to thinking about sound in healthcare environments, and the sound of the beeps and the alarms and everything that's going off, and the research that's been done, individuals coming out of these situations with exhibiting the symptoms of post-traumatic stress as a result of the sound. And so researchers are looking at ways where they can develop sounds that still communicate what needs to be communicated to a practitioner in terms of signals, but maybe don't create a cacophony for the patient. And this, is really all about design and thinking, again, bringing design principles to the decision-making process. So whether it's how you're showing up in Clubhouse or how your product is showing up in the world, you need to be thinking about the impact on the listener. And the last thing that I'll mention is, you commented about our voices. And in some ways, that really is our personal sonic brands. That's how we get to know each other. Our voices are flexible enough that you can recognize my voice, and then you can begin, as you get to know me, to pick up on the cues. Is Steve excited? Is Steve sad? Is Steve angry? And yet you still know it's Steve. And the more we get to know each other, we get to a point where I can say your name, call out to you from across the street, and before you even turn around to see me, that's Steve. And that's a practical metaphor for what we do with brands. And brands very often, when they're not consistent and disciplined in their approach to sound, it's like they're changing their voice every time you encounter them. So imagine that if you and I are talking, and, the next time we talk, maybe my voice sounds like this. I'm from the South. Or maybe some other times I've got it down lower. You would just think I was absolutely crazy. I mean, you wouldn't trust me. You might find it humorous and, be wondering every time you talk to me, oh, what's Steve going to sound like today? But that's how brands operate all the time. And it's a simple illustration of, the problems that you can create for yourself when you don't think about just showing up authentically and consistently.
Which is the base of every branding.
Yes.
To be who you are and not someone else, and to adapt to situations or context, but still be you as a person. Mm-hmm. If we take the analogy between music and business, there's also a difference between hearing and listening. So sometimes we hear stuff or we don't hear it. And we just talked about the signals or the cues, like the church, come to me, or the beep of a truck backing up, saying go away. So all these messages need to bring something over. But when we go to business and we take this as an analogy, it's also that businesses are very, very much focused on telling stuff, on getting something across. And you wrote a piece about that the reality of most organizations is more concerned on the outputs and not on the inputs. And I like this very, very much. And maybe you can elaborate on this, how you work together with companies where you exactly see it's just about the advertising and something else instead of trying to listen, which would also be a link to what we just talked about in Clubhouse. So not first to get something across, but first try to get something in, to see what's happening there, and being yourself, but together with a crowd.
Yeah, what you're speaking to there is the essence of the strategy piece that's in my title as a sonic strategy director. And another one of my little mantras, I have so many, but another one of my little mantras is that I often say that sonic strategy doesn't start with your ears, it starts with what's between them.
Nice.
Very often when we start thinking about sound, we sometimes, again, jump to the tactic of, what's the sound I can put into or onto a brand or the environment, without first stopping and listening and saying, well, what's the sound that's there to begin with? Our process of sonic identity begins with an assessment, and part of that assessment is a series of interviews. It's listening to how the brand has shown up in places in the past, how it's currently showing up, listening to all the consumer touch points, along the way in that consumer journey, where the brand is reaching consumer ears, and what are they hearing? And there's just a lot of practical common sense and common wisdom in the approach when we stop long enough to think about it. And if you think about a relationship, which very often when we talk about brands and consumers, we talk about the brand consumer relationship. Let's just take that to any relationship. If I don't practice active listening, and by that I mean, I'm pausing my own agenda when you're talking to me. I'm not thinking about, oh, you just said that triggers a memory for me. I can't wait till you stop speaking so I can jump into that space and tell you what I just remembered or what I'm thinking, or I interrupt you, or I want to give you the advice. The relationships, I think, for us that we enjoy the most and are most transformative in our lives are relationships where we feel heard. And that means that we feel like the other person is really listening to us and has the capacity to hear and understand. And I think you take that simple metaphor into the brand consumer relationship. And this is where the value of consumer research is, of ethnographic exercises, of interviews comes into play. This is our opportunity to listen. It's not simply about finding, what's the touch points, and if I connect these, can I influence the consumer's behavior and habits? It really is trying to understand what are the needs, what are the drivers, what do consumers need, and how can we show up as a business there. And I also think internally facing, this is another thing for businesses. When you think about employees, when you think about the culture of a company, how are we fostering the ability to listen, the freedom to be able to speak and to be heard, and what is our company culture around these kind of listening behaviors? And that's another dynamic in and of itself, because we often think of sound as consumer facing. But when we do the work, we're often also thinking about, well, sonically, how do your employees relate to this? You're building a soundscape for a retail environment. Think about that employee that has to be there for 8 hours in a day. Are they going to hear the same song 100 times? Can you imagine what that would do to an employee, and ultimately how that will affect the employee's relationship with the consumer? So let's design something where we, have consistency, but we don't have so much repetition that it gets annoying. So it's not just thinking about how you sound to the consumer, but thinking about how are you sounding to your employees, to your stakeholders, and how does that impact, the overall performance of your company in the world.
This also means if you don't listen to your employees, they will not listen to the consumers.
Yeah, very often. And I think that this is a place where companies can do better in terms of training. Businesses doing things that helps their employees learn to listen, not just to consumers, but to each other. And very often this is a failure with upper management and with leadership there. That's a whole other, discussion, around thinking. We've been talking about in the context of advertising, but how some of these principles could be very beneficial to companies as they think about, their training, their decision-making processes, how they're working through finding solutions to problems, and how principles that, we learn in other areas of the world, and particularly in the arts, can be very beneficial to making decisions in corporate structures and business structures, because there are frameworks that we can use and adapt.
How can we help business to develop that skill or that ability to better listen? And you talked about the upper management, so the leadership. I also see leadership needs followership, and if you want to be a good leader, you might be also understand what following means.
Yes.
So that's maybe the listening part of the leadership. So do you have any ideas or any thoughts, or maybe how do you do this in Pandora, in your company?
This is where I could very easily flip the script and turn to me being the interviewer and interviewing you, because, I think some of the work you're doing with music thinking is a brilliant application of this. It's not about trying to turn other people into musicians. It's taking skill sets that you can learn from musicians, the way you work together as a band or an orchestra. What's improvisation? How do you listen effectively to hear this instrument or that instrument? The importance of arrangement and things fitting together. And I think that's where we pull these things in. And certainly, in my business, within our culture, we have the advantage that everybody that I've encountered in our organization loves music, and very often, they've got they play in a band on the side, or they're a vocalist, or they're teaching, or they're actively involved in music or sound, and they bring that passion to work, and they have some of these skill sets that they naturally bring into play. But even if you're not a trained musician, or that part of artistry or creativity isn't part of your regular life, again, sound moves us, and we all have these soundtracks in our lives. And if we just pause enough to start applying simple principles of listening that we can pull from frameworks that are taught as part of music theory, or if you're taking a music lesson, the value is in applying that framework in a new and different way. I have friends in Nashville. I spent 30 years in Nashville, which Music City, USA. And the thing that I loved about Nashville was it was all about the craft of songwriting, the craft of producing, the craft of being an engineer, the craft of being a manager. And so some of my songwriting friends have developed businesses where they work as part of corporate team building workshops, where they will come in and they'll lead a songwriting workshop. And so what will happen is that the employees break into teams. They learn to write a song. They write a song together. That's performed at the end of the day. And the real value isn't in the fact that they've written a song. The real value is in their learning how to apply a skill set in a new and different way. How do we think about melody? How do we collaborate on finding a theme and drawing that through in a new and a unique way? How do we find the particular skill set? This person may be better as a vocalist. This person may be better as an instrumentalist. This person may be better as a lyricist. And so how do we identify and amplify our individual skills to work together as a team to create something? I mean, that's essentially the process. And so it's just using this music framework in a corporate setting as tools that can help to build a team and have solutions. And I think, another aspect of that, particularly with music and music thinking, is there's a lot of emotion. There's a lot of empathy in really learning to listen, whether that's to someone else or it's to a piece of music. We know how music affects our emotions, and our voices can have that impact as well. And there are a lot of things in a context, so if we can understand, how to really listen, how to be empathetic with a listener, to bring that empathy to bear in how we're thinking about what we're saying, how we might modify approach. Now basically I'm starting to talk about a design thinking model. Mm-hmm. And music thinking and design thinking, are mirror each other. As you know, I'm preaching to the choir, but I think this is the value of these kinds of frameworks. And the last thing that I'll say about that is that it's very easy for us to get into habits where we go from point A to point B. We've learned how to get to point A from point B. The way our brains work is trying to find efficiencies to make that happen. And so very often, once we learn that path, we go from point A to point B without paying any attention to what the journey is to get from point A to point B. And so by kind of interjecting something new and different, maybe saying, okay, we want to get from point A to point B, but this road that you've always taken, it's blocked. Yeah. You can't use that anymore. So now here's the chaos we're going to interject into the system. but also this is where creativity is, which is why I believe chaos and creativity go hand in hand. Now we have to find a solution. How are we going to do that? And so using design thinking or using a tool like music thinking basically says we're gonna look at problem solving. Some of this will be familiar, but some is going to be unfamiliar. That may be uncomfortable, but that's actually a good thing because it's going to help us to listen more. One trick sometimes I do in brainstorms, I'll often begin a brainstorm with 60 seconds of silence. And 60 seconds can seem like an hour or longer. And I'll ask folks to start by, first just clasping their hands. Just put your hands together with your fingers intertwined. And some of us will do that and have the thumb of our left hand on top. Some of us will have the thumb of our right hand on top. And I'll say, before we begin these 60 seconds, clasp your hands again, but switch where your thumb is. Right. And so that simple exercise creates a different physical awareness that's odd. And then the silence creates a space, to begin not only listening to our own thoughts, but becoming aware of that different feeling in our body. And then when we begin the brainstorm, we've kind of reset some things. And I've often found that in the flow that comes from that, people are just beginning to be more intentional in their listening.
Right.
So again, these are just simple tricks that, we can use to hack our sensory perception and break us out of habits that perhaps get in the way of us really listening to each other or consumers or the world or our brands.
Wow, great! Thanks for sharing this. And I think that's the nice thing of it. Everybody can do it, as long as you have two hands and you have the people and this twist. And this is also the link to hearing and listening, because sometimes we don't hear stuff because we don't know what it is. It's also like we only can hear what we know. And if we hear something that we don't know, we try to erase it for the moment and focus on all the stuff that we know. This means our audio, our sonic autoimmune system tries to keep us safe from new impressions. And we were looking for the harmony. And I think this is also in the analogy for business. Business are operating maybe in the same thing. Everything that's different, that's going away from the norm or something that we do here or that we say or that's part of us, will always be erased. And I like your exercise very much to just flip it once. Yeah. So there are no 10 variations. It's only one. Just flip it and then look it from the other side. There's another perspective to it.
And I think one other thing that I think is important that relates to this idea of a physical exercise that might impact how we hear things is this idea that our perception of reality of the world around us comes through our senses. And when we talk about sound and even listening, and we're being more intentional, we're focusing on that, there's a danger in forgetting the fact that our experience of the world is a multisensory experience. There's some individuals who may be impaired, and so maybe all of the senses may not be at their disposal. But for many of us, these are multisensory experiences. And in my research, looking at cross-modalism, which is the way the modalities or sensory modalities work together, we found that one sense can influence another sense and we can hack our perception. I can change your perception of flavor of that piece of chocolate in your mouth. I can make it taste more bitter or more sweet, depending on the soundscapes that I'm putting into your earbuds versus the tastes that hitting your taste buds. And so when we think about sound, another one of my quips is that sound doesn't happen in a vacuum, and that's in terms of physics, that's absolutely true. And so we need to think about how sound is impacting our other perceptions and vice versa. So very often when we're listening, we need to be aware of what is the environment, and that sometimes by changing environmental cues, you could think about what's the color of the room that you're brainstorming in. What's the color of your brand? How is that an expression? Thinking about other aspects of design, of texture, of smell. And I think part of active listening isn't just in terms of what you're hearing, but active listening is also the awareness of other sensory perception.
Absolutely. You would listen with your whole body in this.
Yes. And so paying attention to what are distractions, what are environments, and how can we help focus the way we're hearing, and what does what we're hearing, how does that impact what we're seeing or some other sensory input.
Right.
So I just felt like that was an important call out, because as much as we're talking about sound, we're not talking about it isolated from everything else.
Absolutely. And I'm glad that you bring it up. That's also the idea of music thinking. It's not only about music, it's about being the multisensory part, and music, it's just a catalyzer, and trying to bring it up. And this is also, it comes up to me at the moment. We have this COVID situation since more than a year. How can sound help us because you just talked about with the sound, you could change the way how things taste. It could also help us to help us to maybe have 1.5 meter distance. And how can we do this? Is everybody has earbuds and is not listening to the environment, but only listening to themselves. So what's your take on that?
Well, again, I think this comes back to intention. And I wrote a piece at the beginning of COVID about how the world sounded very different to me, because I'm always listening. That's part of my job. And what we found during COVID was that there were different things that were happening. I mean, there was an article that was written about San Francisco and the fact that there was birdsong being heard that hadn't been heard before, because the cities were quieter. We heard of that a lot in environments. There are ways in which we're forced to listen to a partner or someone that we're locked into space with more. And we've seen from some of the research that was even problematic. In certain countries, a rise in divorce rates or even domestic abuse, because of being in these locked down spaces. So I've tried to use this as an opportunity to say what sounds different, what sounds the same, and on the other side of this, what have I learned? What are sounds that I want to be paying more attention to? What are sounds that I want to be encouraging more? And again, as we've said time and time again through our conversation, it's just about frameworks and intention. And we found that listening habits through COVID, there was a lot of nostalgia. People were going back to things that they were familiar with, old songs. We'd seen ways in which music was being used as a social surrogate. That because there's very often memories that we have around music, memories of situations, things with people, whether they be a group event or a loved one, and that the triggers, the memories that are evoked there, weren't simply of time in our life, but also of these relationships, and that was kind of taking the place of being able to actually be with those individuals. So I think we're going to see more research come out. I was a part of a small group of academics, actually people who are much smarter than I am, and they were starting to study early on what were some of these shifts. And so we're beginning to see some research in terms of listening habits. It'll be interesting to see on the other side of this, where this goes. Certainly, we talked about Clubhouse earlier. I think the explosion of Clubhouse, was because we were so starved for group conversations. There are questions. Well, what will happen on the other side of COVID? As things open back up and we kind of return to life as usual, how will some of these spaces that are more audio first or audio only translate into this world? And my hope is that they continue to thrive, and we find a way to look at how we're showing up in these spaces differently than how we're showing up in other spaces, and what are things that we can bring from conversations into a new world and a different environment.
Right.
I think I answered your question. I don't know if I danced around it, but for me, it's been focused on how the world sounds different, and what I take from that with me as we come out of COVID.
Right. It's also less answering a question, but more having a conversation in that sense, that you're triggering things that I have to also to think about. And I would like to make a connection with another field where I'm engaged in the think tank, where we talk about brands with a conscience. Mm-hmm. So this could on one part be also would brands with a conscience, and with the conscience being like everything that's going on, and it's going around us, from climate change to all the things that our society and our planet is experiencing. And in that part, we think that the old generation thinking, like baby boomer, Generation X, the millennials, Generation C, that is also created by the West, by the Western world, for advertising, mm-hmm. to just divide different generations. And we came up with something like Generation Co, like the Co from co-creation, communication, mm-hmm. and also COVID and Corona. So is this a new generation? And my question for you would be, what would be a sound aspect of this? Would this be a harmony, or maybe it's a stupid question because I know there is no one answer, but I just want to trigger your thinking on that part. Is it possible that we can be connected with sound that also works not in an advertising way that is segmented by old generation segments, but by a new generation that connects us from here to Aboriginal people in wherever in the world?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot to unpack there. I would say, to your point, generally when we talk about these cultural groups, millennials, Gen X, Gen Z, baby boomers, these are essentially constructs that we very often use in marketing to try and simplify communications, and yet in the real world, these constructs don't always hold up really well. It's easy to use them to stereotype, to put people in boxes, and people are much more complicated. Generations are much more complicated. There are probably far more similarities than there are differences. And within any of these groups, there are certainly cohorts. Here in the U.S., pre 9/11, post 9/11. And now we have pre-COVID, post-COVID. Yes, certainly these events can be transformative and could be pivot points. But I tend to, try and look beyond the stereotypes and look for more of the through lines. However, I do think that there's something to be said in talking about what you mentioned, in terms of purpose, of meaning, of social conscience and awareness and cultural capital from a brand standpoint. Mm-hmm. I think we need to be careful because I think that, again, this can become a phrase, and brands can hop on the bandwagon of causes,
yes,
in an attempt to, pander to consumers, and can begin to do what we would call virtue signaling, which is essentially I'm saying all the right things, and yet if you dig a little bit deeper, my walk doesn't match my talk.
Yeah.
And so, I'm interested in looking at, talking specifically about advertising and advertisers, the way that advertising has had an impact on culture. And we can go through and look at how advertising products have shaped the cultural milieu, if you will, of a region or a country or a group of people. And I'm thinking now, as we think about sonically, how that may show up with some of the work that I'm doing that I'm most passionate about at the moment, which is thinking about race, and race as a sonic construct. And particularly here in the U.S., where the dominant culture, white, has so marginalized the minority culture. And here I'm speaking specifically of not just all minorities, but of the Black population. Mm-hmm. And how essentially, if you look at the history, sonically, we have marginalized them from the very beginning, from describing the sound of their voice or the sound that is associated with the Black community, and how that has so racialized our listening, mm-hmm. that we have defined what it means to sound Black, mm-hmm. versus to sound white. And so in my own research, particularly in COVID, I noticed all these COVID commercials, and there was an individual on YouTube that had spliced them all together, and it was a kind of a funny viral video because they all sounded the same. They're using the same words, but the thing that I noticed was that in these some 70 odd commercials that were edited together, over 90% of the voiceovers were white. And yet COVID affects the Black population 3 times as much for a number of reasons than the white population. So why am I only hearing white voices? And my contention is, at least here in the U.S., we have defined the voice of the general market, and perhaps even the voice of America as white. And so in our creative choices, this, for lack of a better term, this sonic racism has crept in, and when we hire Black voiceover talent, it's often because we're wanting to hear them sound a particular way. Right. And I have been in, to my horror, I have been in voiceover sessions where I've heard a director direct voiceover talent, could you sound more urban? Or could you sound less urban? And they might have, they could have just as easily said, could you sound more black? Could you sound less black? In fact, I heard one voiceover talent say that actually a director said to them in a session, could you put more cotton in your voice?
Wow.
And so these are ways in which we don't often think about race as a sonic construct. We think of it visually. And so, in our attempts to be more diverse in our advertising, maybe we're seeing more diversity, but that's different than hearing more diversity. And that raises a whole lot of other questions, but that's just a way of talking about, ways that we can think about sound from a purpose standpoint, from a meaning standpoint, from a sonic diversity, equity, and inclusion standpoint. And so that's kind of my passion, and a passion for us at Studio Resonate and at SXM, where we've launched an initiative at standfordiversity.com, where we're attempting to have advertisers and brands take a look at how they're casting, what their voiceover rosters are, and how can we move away from this default casting, particularly here in the U.S.
Oh, I like very much what you say on that part, because it's also the question, is it ignorance, or are you so much biased that you don't even hear it? So you can't only hear what you know. And if you never heard or never heard that argument, then you just go on what you do. So I think this is a very good point.
Yeah, it's a little of both. And I think this ties us back to our intentional listening.
Right.
Because what I'm trying to do, as we're getting out and into presentations, is I'm talking about diversity, but now I'm using a different angle. I'm saying, leave this presentation listening to the world in a different way. How do you hear diversity in your communities? How do you hear diversity in your workplace? How do you hear diversity in your advertising? And how are we addressing diversity or the lack of it, and hoping that at the very least changes or impacts the conversation, so that we're listening differently and we can speak to it in a different manner.
Right. It connects with what I just said about brands with a conscience. If you're conscious because you have the awareness to understand what it is, then you have the ability to act or not. Yes. But then it's a decision to act or not just doing something like you always did because everybody wanted it or asked for it, and you never got the idea that it might be wrong. And I think that's a very strong one. So how can we help others to develop ways to foster sonic diversity? Or maybe diversity, like we said, the multisensory part. So it's not only sonic. So how can we help people to be more aware of diversity, and when we are using biases and going a certain direction?
I think it starts with these kind of conversations like we're having. Hopefully, whoever's listening to this might spark the thought, I never thought to listen that way. And so hopefully just from this conversation and other conversations like it, we begin the process. But there are some other specific things that we can do. And again, on the standforsonicdiversity.com, we outline a lot of these. But what we're advocating for is, first look at talent rosters, whether you're a vendor that's supplying voiceover talent or you're a company that's leaning into a vendor with voiceover talent. Make sure that the roster is diversified, and that there's a good percentage of diverse voices there. And then the second thing we can do is look at our casting practices. Are we just not thinking about it and thinking, oh, I'll hire a Black voice talent when I'm speaking to a Black consumer, as opposed to thinking about, I'm going to represent the general diversity of the world by diversifying the voices that are speaking. And so how do we change our casting practices so that we're casting more diverse voices? And then beyond that, we need to begin looking at, not just the voice talent, but the people that are behind that too. So people who are writing the scripts, the creative directors, people that are thinking about, the campaigns. We need more diversity there. If I, as a white male, am writing a script for a Black female, it's not that I might not be capable of, as a good copywriter, writing something that could be effective, but there's potential that I may be putting words into the voice of a Black female voice actor that would be stereotypical or even potentially offensive. So we need to diversify the people that are kind of thinking about the creative, building the creative, and we need to foster opportunities where we can hear this diversity in the world and in our companies. So it's more than just having the corporate headshots.
Right.
We need to make sure that we're fostering the opportunities to hear each other in new ways, to hear our voices, and to ask questions about what we're hearing and what we're listening. Because particularly when it comes to race, there are a few dialectical or maybe timbral markers that exist, but once you remove those, again, the similarities are far greater than the differences. And even asking the question, what does it mean to sound Black? Right. What does it mean to sound white? Pushes us to begin to think about, this is really less about the person speaking. It's more about the person listening, which brings us back full circle to, the work that we're doing, whether it's sonic identity or whether it's music thinking, is really about the listener and the perception of the listener, and how are we educating, training, influencing the listener.
Thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate this, because listening is one of the top leadership skills, and I feel honored about this. It is my mission to find, create, and share inspirations for meaningful collaboration based on music analogies. If you want to support this, please subscribe to the podcast, give us a rating, or write a review on iTunes or Spotify. And more inspirations can be found on musicthinking.com. We have a blog, and you can download the Music Thinking Framework. And finally, I would love to hear your feedback. And if you need help with a business challenge, please reach out to me via email, podcast@musicthinking.com.